Imagine a bell sounding across stone as dawn cools the hills above Nice, 24 May 1989. A typed arrest warrant slides from a leather folder. Boots track chapel dust. A gate opens and closes before most people in the neighborhood notice. French gendarmes enter the priory of Saint Joseph and detain Paul Touvier, a Vichy militia official sheltered by Catholic networks for years. The door that closes on this arrest opens a larger question: how post-war Europe's religious houses intersected with perpetrators and with atonement. The warrant carried strata of dates and jurisdictions. June 1944 in the Lyon region, where 7 Jewish hostages were shot at Rillieux-la-Pape after the assassination of Vichy propaganda minister Philippe Henriot. 1946 and 1947, death sentences in absentia for collaboration and pillage. 1971, a presidential pardon that erased one sentence but not allegations tied to crimes against humanity. Archival exhibits cited prefecture files, German security reports recovered in 1945, and witness statements accumulated across 4 decades. The dossier identified Touvier as a milice cadre in Lyon, accused of approving or relaying reprisal measures during the occupation's final summer. Corridors inside the priory held the beeswax shine of a side table and the odor of incense embedded in brickwork. According to court records and press investigations, Touvier had rotated through private addresses and religious properties linked to traditionalist Catholic circles, including houses associated with the Society of St. Pius X. Motivations attributed to hosts ranged from charity to anti-communist reflex. Precise chains of assistance remain unevenly documented. Admission books are incomplete, and several benefactors left no written trace. What is clear is the persistence of Nazi hunters, notably the Klarsfeld network, whose filings and public pressure helped drive the case until a judge issued the warrant executed at dawn on this hillside. A stamp struck purple ink. A register recorded the hour. The arrest unfolded as a judicial procedure in a residence where prayer books lay open beside breakfast plates. The juxtaposition made headlines. A fugitive connected to a 1944 execution located behind a cloister wall. Priory officials told journalists they had acted from mercy, not politics. National debate shifted to a harder line. When does shelter become obstruction? The episode exposed a broader post-war pattern in parts of Europe where religious houses, particularly in Italy and France, sheltered men later identified as perpetrators. In Rome, documented aid organized by Bishop Al-Wahidul used Red Cross papers and church contacts to move fugitives such as Franz Stangl. Other alleged channels remain contested in the literature. French law set the frame. By the late 1980s, jurisprudence had established that crimes against humanity were imprescriptible. With Touvier's transfer from Nice, that doctrine moved from legal commentary to courtroom. Prosecutors prepared a record built from June 1944 orders, Millis German coordination notes, exhumation files compiled after liberation, and ballistic and identification reports. The Versailles Cour-Decises would test whether signatures and authority linked Touvier directly to the execution of 7 Jewish prisoners on 29 June 1944. Bishop's statements in the days after the arrest acknowledged clerical assistance to the fugitive and asked forgiveness from victims' families, marking an institutional effort to distinguish spiritual care from the enabling of impunity. The same period's archives also preserve the other side of the ledger, monasteries that hid Jewish children and resistance couriers at mortal risk. Identical architectural spaces, cells, refectories, chapels, held opposite moral choices. The van door slid shut. The escort moved north. 5 years later, after evidentiary hearings that reconstructed kilometer by kilometer the movements around Lyon in the last week of June 1944, a French court convicted Touvier of crimes against humanity and imposed a life sentence. He died under guard in 1996. The nice arrest endures because it revealed more than one man's concealment. It brought to the surface paper trails showing how some religious properties sheltered fugitives, and public statements signaling attempts at accountability within the same institutions. The bell that sounded across St. Joseph did not only summon prayer, it carried a civic summons as well, forcing a reckoning over complicity, sanctuary, penance, and the requirement, before any claim to atonement, of passing through the hard door of law. A personnel jacket marked Einsatzkommando 6 is unknotted in an archive. You move past the smell of paper glue and see the earlier entry, Protestant pastor, 1924. Ernst by Burstein, born Ernst Szymanowski, joined the NSDAP in 1926, entered the SS by 1936, and in 1941 commanded EK-6 under Einsatzgruppe in occupied Ukraine, a unit documented by the Einsatzgruppen trial as responsible for mass shootings. Photographs of road culverts and pit edges sit beside typed reports with numbers of the dead. His trajectory from pulpit to mobile killing squad sets up a post-war collision between church law, criminal law, and claims of repentance. A baptism registry from Stettin lists his ordination vows, neatly scripted in violet ink, an early marker of a ministry that would later be scrubbed from parish histories. Seminary classmates listed in regional church bulletins took country parishes. By Burstein transferred to the chaplaincy of a police regiment by 1933, citing national renewal. Personnel sheets show promotions that track the expanding machinery of state violence. By June 1941, SS Sturmbannführer, logistical authority over ammunition allotments, vehicle pools, and prisoner transports for EK-6. Operational situation reports preserved on microfilm detail actions near Zhytomyr, Kremenchuk, and Poltava. Figures in the margins: 383, 734, 1246, record estimated Jewish victims after each sweep. A typed order dated 12 October 1941 instructs subunits to coordinate with Army Group South for fuel and cartage to the next rail hub. Contemporaneous Army diaries note the arrival of EK-6 trucks at 08:50, departure 14:20, weather cold, roads firm. The killings themselves are traced through post-war forensic teams. Brass cartridges recovered at trench edges match requisitions, signed off by Burstein's quartermaster. No personal reflections survive, only signatures that linked pulpit handwriting to ballistic supply. Detention came in December 1945 at Neumünster internment camp after a former parishioner recognized the name on an Allied wanted list. Trial records from Case 9, United States v. Otto Ohlendorf et al., placed by Burstein in the dock on 29 September 1947. The judgment cites command responsibility for at least 2,000 civilian deaths. Sentencing sheets issued 10 April 1948 prescribed death by hanging. A blue pencil note, dated 24 January 1951, records High Commissioner John J. McCloy's commutation to life imprisonment amid broader clemency reviews. Church files reopen in 1954 when the Evangelical Church in Germany convenes a disciplinary chamber. Minutes describe a defendant who professes guilt and requests removal from clerical office. The panel defrocks him but recommends pastoral counseling in prison. Release papers from Landsberg, 9 May 1958, list occupation. Former clergyman, health. Good, destination. Cell. Surveillance summaries compiled by Lower Saxony police in the early 1960s note quiet civilian work for a church charity warehouse. No public preaching permitted. Microfilm rolls end with a final annotation. Died 8 December 1986, Neustädtem Rubenberg, buried without ecclesiastical honors. Between violet ink vows and gray SS requisitions, the record holds no monologue, only the friction of overlapping jurisdictions, synod, field command, tribunal, each inscribing its own ledger of authority and sin. A stamp hits purple ink. A church board in Schleswig-Holstein deliberates by Bernstein's status after a decade in prison. His death sentence commuted to life, and then reduced. Exact meeting dates vary by file, but the decision lands in 1958. You watch a clerk sign off on clerical rights and pension restoration to a convicted SS commander. Survivors' groups read the same notice and protest. Press coverage forces the regional synod to explain how forgiveness sits beside accountability. The reinstatement becomes a bellwether case for how far post-war churches will go to reintegrate former perpetrators. Typed minutes from the Kirchenleitung, marked 3 April 1958 in one folder and 10 April in another, record a vote of 9-3. Arguments for reinstatement cite by Bernstein's formal confession before the Wurtemberg Penitentiary Chaplaincy, an affidavit from prison psychologist Dr. Karl Gutermuth rating his sustained contrition, and a legal opinion that clemency nullified the impediment to office. Coffee rings stained the corner of the carbon copy. Someone underlined pastoral shortage in rural parishes with a blunt red pencil. The procedural path passes through layers of ink and bureaucracy. The church's disciplinary chamber had already defrocked him in 1954, yet left a clause, reevaluation contingent upon demonstrable repentance and state clemency. Once federal authorities authorized early conditional release on 9 May 1958, that clause re-entered debate. Pension regulations, revised during West Germany's 1957 social law reform, allowed reinstated clergy to reclaim past service credits. Actuarial worksheets inside the file calculate back pay to 1924, minus wartime military stipend. 3 days after the board's vote, a mimeograph circular reaches the Association of Victims of the Nazi Regime. Their statement, carried by Die Welt on 15 April, lists shooting actions attributed to Einsatzkommando 6, Zhytomyr, Poltava, Kamyanets-Podilsky, and asks how a pulpit can stand above graves it helped fill. Regional Synod President Pastor Hans Joachim Ewend releases a press note emphasizing gospel forgiveness, but acknowledges public misunderstanding and calls for further consultation. Archival clippings show headlines dividing on theology versus justice. Letters to editors run 3-1 against reinstatement. Behind the scenes, the Evangelical Church in Germany convenes a federal-level commission. Its dossier cites Nuremberg Judgment IX, paragraph 780, affirming command responsibility for systematic murder. On 24 June 1958, the commission advises that reinstatement would irreparably damage moral authority. Schleswig-Holstein's board rescinds the pension order on 2 July, issuing a revised ruling. License for lay diaconal work only, no clerical collar, no public preaching, pension limited to minimum welfare stipend. Ledger pages close with a notation in blue ink. Final, no further appeal. What remains is a case study written not in sermons but in ledgers and newsprint, showing how every signature after 1945 carried the echo of automatic fire at Ukrainian ravines. You turn a dog tag between your fingers and then a corded rosary. Both belong to Jerian Goldman, a German who began as a Franciscan seminarian, was conscripted as a medic, and at times assigned to SS formations, and continued his path to priesthood amidst war. Records indicate he received special authorization for ordination during 1944, and after the war departed for Japan, where he pursued missionary work among the poor and sick. His file is crucial context. An SS uniform does not always mean perpetration, but the uniform's shadow shaped his post-war atonement. He carried a vow instead of a sentence, and chose to serve in a country his side had once fought. A personnel card in the Berlin Wehrkreis archive notes conscription, 23 August 1939, branch, Sanitätsdienst, religious status, theology student, Franciscan province of Saxony. Subsequent notations track transfers through the 7th SS Volunteer Mountain Division, Prince Eugen Medical Platoon, then to the 90th Panzer Grenadier Division's Field Hospital near Monte Cassino. Logbooks list issuance of 11 morphine ampules per medic per week and document improvised chapels set up in wine cellars. Allied artillery shattered those field stations in February 1944. Casualty rosters list Goldman twice wounded, but returned to duty. A Vatican file labeled Nuntius Berlin contains correspondence dated March-June 1944, indicating a dispensation for Goldman to advance to diaconate despite active service. The document cites scarcity of clergy at front lines and references precedent from World War I trench chaplaincies. Photocopies of Swiss border crossing permits place him briefly in Orsolina, Ticino Canton, 29 June 1944, where Bishop Franz von Streng conferred orders in a private chapel at 05:30 under Red Cross oversight. Swiss police diaries confirm the seminarian left the country within 24 hours, rejoining his unit in northern Italy with an altar stone wrapped in medical gauze. Capture records from Civitavecchia, 12 September 1944, list Goldman among 147 medical personnel taken by the U.S. 88th Infantry Division. POW transport manifests trace a route. Naples convoy, HMT Pasteur, Norfolk, Camp Clifton, Texas. In the camp's infirmary, he assisted with influenza outbreaks while negotiating with military chaplains for permission to celebrate Mass. A memorandum from the U.S. Office of the Provost Marshal, 7 February 1945, authorizes limited liturgical functions, noting prisoner morale benefits. Post-release emigration papers stamped 14 April 1954 show destination: Yokohama. Mission logs of the Franciscan province of the Holy Martyrs of Japan record arrival 10 May and immediate assignment to a tuberculosis hospice in Saitama Prefecture. Annual reports list 18 beds in 1955. By 1961, the facility expanded to 120, with funding from German Caritas and Japanese dioceses. Construction invoices detail 600 sacks of cement, 1,200 roof tiles, and one chapel bell recast from battlefield shell casings shipped from Bremerhaven. Each ledger, Wehrmacht medical inventory, Vatican dispensation, POW camp order, missionary balance sheet, documents a life that threaded through uniforms, not all chosen. The file ends with a death certificate from Wurzburg, 26 August 2003. Occupation recorded simply as priest, residence Japan. The dog tag and rosary remain paired in the Bundesarchiv exhibit, illustrating how a cord of beads once shared a pocket with field dressings, and how, after 1945, that same cord guided its bearer toward a different theater of service. A passport is pressed to an inky desk at the Collegio Teutonico. A clerical letter of introduction carries a seal. Bishop Ilwa Hudel in Rome and the Croatian Franciscan Krunoslav Draganovic appear repeatedly in police and intelligence files as facilitators of escape routes moving XSS and collaborators to Syria and South America via Italian ports. You trace the path of Otto Wechter, former SS governor, who hides under clerical protection and dies in Rome in 1949 before boarding a ship. Religious paperwork, sometimes forged, sometimes real, becomes a logistics tool for evasion rather than remorse. A customs manifest held in the Archivio di Stato lists an unremarkable consignment: sacks of flour, crates of olive oil, destined for Genoa on 16 July 1948. Attached is a passenger voucher in the name of Alfredo Reinhardt, ecclesiastical courier, stamped by the International Committee of the Red Cross. Allied intelligence later annotates the form. True identity: Otto Wechter, wanted since 1945 for the liquidation of the Krakow ghetto and anti-partisan reprisals in Galicia. Surveillance logs compiled by the Allied Screening Commission show the voucher originated inside the German Priest College in Vatican City, signed by Monsignor Hudel with a brief Greek motto below. The signature provided diplomatic weight. Italian border officials, wary of infringing Vatican prerogatives, rarely challenged papers bearing his seal. The corridor functioned through precise geography. Safe houses ringed Vatican properties on Via del Fornaci and Via Orlia. Directives in Dragonovic's hand instructed couriers to move fugitives after Compline, when clerical foot traffic drew little notice. From there, the fugitives reached the Austrian hospice on Via dei Serpenti or the Santa Maria dell'Anima guest rooms, each location coded in diary shorthand. Stanza 12, or Cappella B, to confuse routine searches by Italian police. British military intelligence decrypted several of these diary codes in early 1947. A memorandum from the Allied Control Commission's Counterintelligence Subcommittee warned that forged baptismal certificates issued by the Collegio Teutonico had already moved more than 40 classified Category III war criminals through Civitavecchia and Genoa. Railway schedules complete the map. The 0947 Rapido to Genoa Brignole, 4 hours north, stopped at Pisa and La Spezia. Watchers noted individuals with Vatican laces passer often boarded one stop beyond Rome to avoid predictable checkpoints. Passenger lists for the troop-converted SS Giovanna C., a freighter sailing 3 February 1949 to Buenos Aires, include 7 names later linked to Baltic police battalions, each embarked with Red Cross travel documents citing stateless refugee status, the legal loophole created by the 1946 Allied Displaced Persons Directive. Port Authority ledgers reference a single group ticket purchased by the Pontificia Commission di Assistenza, the Vatican's relief office. Accounting sheets reveal cash supplied via Banco di Roma accounts controlled by Dragonovic. Otto Wechter's itinerary reveals the system's limits. Medical files from Santo Spirito Hospital record admission, 13 July 1949, diagnosis: jaundice and renal failure, likely from contaminated Tiber water while hiding at the monastery of San Girolamo. Death follows on 14 August. A sealed letter from Hudel to the widow refuses autopsy on religious grounds, an objection overruled by Italian authorities but rendered moot when family declines repatriation. Police photographs capture the passport, the forged baptism entry, and a ticket stub for the freighter Anna Salane, scheduled to sail 2 weeks later. Allied diplomats debated prosecution of clergy. Memoranda between the U.S. Embassy and the Italian Interior Ministry cite concerns about Vatican sovereignty. By late 1949, under combined intelligence objectives, the focus shifts to monitoring rather than arresting facilitators. Internal church correspondence, preserved in the Congregation for Religious Archives, shows mounting pressure. Bishops from France and Netherlands demanded an investigation into Hudel's activities. No canonical trial followed. Instead, Pope Pius XII accepted Hudel's resignation in April 1952, recorded in a 3-line bulletin without comment on the Ratlins. Ledger lines close with traffic data. Between 1945 and 1951, Italian maritime police tallied 34,972 stateless departures through Genoa and Bari. Estimates attribute at least 800 of those exits to networks anchored in ecclesiastical protection. Each ink stamp in the corridor's paperwork carried 2 shadows: the refugee crisis of post-war Europe and the unresolved reckoning with state-sponsored murder. A prison chaplain's register at Dusseldorf notes visits in June and July 1971. You follow the line item to a corpse wagon manifest dated a day after an interview session. Franz Stangl, commandant of Sobibor and Treblinka, finally confronted by survivor testimony and meticulous train lists, dies of heart failure hours after acknowledging legal and moral responsibility in part to an interviewer. A priest had been scheduled again but never returned to that door. Whatever he sought at the end, absolution did not annul the ledger of transports he signed. His death without sentence completion intensifies debates over late remorse. Cell 213 of the Justizvollzugsanstalt Dusseldorf measured 3 paces by 6, whitewashed and lit by a single 40-watt bulb. Prison maintenance logs note a special writing table delivered on 28 May 1971 to accommodate ongoing interviews conducted by Austrian journalist Gitta Sereny under warden supervision. Audio tape requisition forms list 7 BASF reels used across 16 sessions. Corrections officers documented start and stop times to the minute. Total recorded duration: 27 hours, 14 minutes. Stangel's medical chart kept in the adjacent infirmary already flagged chronic hypertension, a condition monitored since his extradition from Brazil in 1967. Court transcripts from the 1969 Dusseldorf Treblinka trial fill 22 bound volumes. Key exhibits include Reichsbahn waybills detailing 104 overcrowded transports from Warsaw, Radom, and Lublin districts. Each bears Stangel's counter-signature verifying camp readiness. The appellate decision, pending at the time of his death, concerned whether the life sentence imposed in December 1970 should be reaffirmed or recalibrated. Defense motions argued diminished direct involvement. Prosecution filings countered with eyewitness rosters listing 19 former guards who placed Stangel on platform inspections. On 27 June, the chaplain's log records communion and a request for confession. The priest noted signs of agitation, pulse 110. 2 days later, prison doctor Dr. Heinz Werner cleared Stangel for continued interviews but prescribed increased dosage of reserpine. Interview session 16 took place on 28 June, finishing at 1940. Guard shift reports mentioned Stangel appearing exhausted yet lucid. At 22:05, cell patrol found him collapsed beside the bunk. Emergency response protocol initiated within 3 minutes. Oxygen, atropine, external cardiac massage terminated at 22:39. Death certificate cites myocardial infarction. Secondary cause: long-standing hypertension. News tickers the next morning flashed the headline before court clerks could draft a procedural closure. Survivor associations responded immediately. Minutes of the Treblinka Committee meeting in Tel Aviv record frustration that the appellate ruling and any further testimony died with the prisoner. The West German Ministry of Justice closed the file on 15 July, noting sentence served: 1 year, 6 months. In Catholic press forums, theologians debated the weight of a deathbed confession versus judicial accountability. Prison chaplain correspondence, preserved in diocesan archives, states that sacramental care for perpetrators demands visible repentance and willingness to accept civil judgment, criteria unresolved by Stangel's abrupt end. The empty cell inventory lists 2 rosaries, a pair of reading glasses, trial transcripts bookmarked at witness statement 478, and a draft letter to his family requesting prayers. Nothing in that inventory altered the arithmetic of 900,000 victims tallied by post-war demographers. The corpse wagon manifest merely closed the door on a living defendant, leaving historians and ethicists to measure whether late remorse without completed sentence constitutes atonement or an unfinished reckoning. You ride in the escort truck across the inner yard of Landsberg Prison, 1948. The wood of the gallows smells of creosote and rain. Catholic and Protestant chaplains documented their ministry to condemned SS men whose sentences followed the Nuremberg successor trials. The chaplains' logs note prayers, confessions, and refusals. The liturgy in these pages forces a hard question: can ritual comfort coexist with justice for victims whose names fill the same files? The answer shapes pastoral practice in German prisons for decades. Execution dockets preserved in the U.S. Army's War Crimes Branch list 3 clusters of hangings: 28 May, 7 June, and 11 June 1948. Each docket begins with a medical clearance, followed by an authorization signed by General Lucius D. Clay. Names appear in alphabetical procession: Hans Almir, Karl Baber, Heinrich Ewers, alongside briefcase numbers referencing Dachau, Mauthausen, Buchenwald. A separate column records chaplain consulted, yes/no, specifying denomination and time of final rites. Father Joseph Neuner's diary, held in the Augsburg Diocesan Archive, describes entering a cell at 03:10 to find Ewers reciting Psalm 51 in German. Neuner administered communion, marked the page with a linen ribbon, and wrote, "Expressed regret for crimes committed under orders." Protestant pastor Wilhelm Werhelin's parallel notebook tells a different encounter. Karl Baber declined prayer, stating only, "Too late." Werhelin underlined the phrase twice and appended a marginal note quoting Ezekiel 33:11, "I have no pleasure in the death of the wicked." Such annotations later informed the Kirchenleitung's 1950 guidelines on chaplain neutrality when ministering to war criminals, advising acknowledgement of guilt as condition for sacramental absolution. Execution protocols scheduled hymns at the condemned's request. Records show 6 men chose "Nearer, My God, to Thee," 4 selected "Grosser Gott, were Lob and Ditch," and 1 requested silence. A U.S. Army psychologist observing the proceedings logged heart rates between 120 and 160 beats per minute in the final walk from cell block B to scaffold, noting a brief drop when hymns commenced. Evidence, he suggested, of music's pacifying effect even under extreme stress. Victim families received notice of execution dates by certified mail, but no opportunity for presence or statement. Lists of murdered prisoners, often entire transport rosters, were attached to case files. Chaplains read them before entering cells, an administrative requirement meant to confront the condemned with documented atrocities. Whether those lists altered final words appears inconsistent. 9 of 28 men uttered variations of apology referencing unnamed victims. The rest spoke of God, Germany, or nothing at all. Post-execution procedures included a medical pronouncement at 05:00, photographic documentation, and interment in unmarked graves at Plot E of the U.S. Military Cemetery in Schwabstadel. Chaplains were present but barred from graveside prayer. A separation codified in Occupation Directive JCS 1067 to avoid creating martyr symbolism. After each hanging sequence, Father Neuner and Pastor Werhelin signed joint memoranda summarizing spiritual care given, recommending continued pastoral presence, yet affirming court verdicts as morally necessary. These memoranda circulated to diocesan and synod offices, becoming templates for West German prison ministry, once control transferred from U.S. to Bavarian authorities in 1951. The gallows came down in 1952, dismantled plank by plank. The creosote scent lingered in the storage shed for years. Chaplain logs, bound now in brown linen, remain as artifacts where hymn titles share margins with crime codes. Their coexistence continues to challenge theologians and jurists. Mercy offered beside an instrument of legal death, and the unresolved space between a condemned man's last verse and the silence owed to the dead. A monastery necrology lies open. You scan the admissions at Maria Lach and Heiligenkreuz across 1945-1955 and match birth years to war service. Many entries note Wehrmacht service. Some records indicate Waffen-SS, though not always with unit detail. Numbers and identities vary by house, and some files remain closed. Verified names of war criminals who later took solemn monastic vows are scarce in public sources. Claims circulate, documentation is uneven, and several alleged cases are unconfirmed. The archival reality is narrower than rumor, but it shows how cloisters became post-war shelters for men returning from violent service. Ledger columns at Maria Lach list postulants by secular name, birthplace, baptism parish, and military experience. Of 74 men accepted between August 1945 and December 1950, 48 carry the notation Wehrmacht, 6 note Waffen-SS, 5 leave the field blank, and the rest record auxiliary services. Only 1 Waffen-SS entry supplies a unit, 3/SS Sanitätsamt, 2 Medical Company, 2nd SS Panzer Division does Reich. No disciplinary record accompanies the file. Tribunal searches conducted in 1961 for a diocesan review found no pending charges, and the postulant, later Brother Anselm, remained a lay brother engaged in horticulture until his death in 1993. Heiligenkreuz Abbey in Lower Austria kept admission registers separate from military questionnaires stored in a sealed envelope labeled Belastung, burden. A 2008 university commission, granted partial access, reported 3 monks with Waffen-SS backgrounds out of 112 post-war entrants. None appeared on war crimes indictments. The Commission's footnotes cite Vienna provincial court correspondence confirming no charges. However, because Allied denazification records for rural Lower Austria were lost in a 1954 flood, gaps persist. Rumors of SS monks often pivot on the Benedictine house at St. Attilian, where returning Eastern Front medics underwent spiritual retreats in 1946. Examination of the house chronicles shows temporary stays, not vows, and no evidence of men convicted or even formally accused of atrocities. Similarly, allegations that former Einsatzkommando officer Anton Maloth entered a Carthusian charter house dissolve under basic scrutiny. Charter house reception records for the decade list 0 German nationals. Canon law imposed hurdles, a minimum 1-year novitiate, public declaration of legal standing, and testimony from the candidate's parish and military district. After 1952, the German Bishops' Conference added an internal directive requiring a denazification certificate or proof of completed sentence before simple vows. Monastic councils sometimes added inquiries of their own. Minutes at Maria Loch record abbots asking candidates whether they had taken innocent life and transcribing the answers. Where uncertainty lingered, the entry was postponed. Archival threads therefore confirm a small number of ex-Waffen-SS men reaching vows, most with medical or signals assignments, and no documented criminal proceedings. High-profile war criminals, those tried at Nuremberg, Dachau, or later German courts, do not appear in the cloister death books. The pattern suggests cloisters served as spiritual refuges for veterans wrestling with complicity at varying degrees, but not as systematic havens for prosecuted perpetrators. The rumor survives partly because many files remain sealed under privacy law until 70 years after death. Until those volumes open, the narrative sits between caution and conjecture, anchored by the sparse, sober lines of the necrologies themselves. A Department of Justice file clicks open. Photographs from Bucharest, January 1941, sit beside naturalization forms from the 1950s in the United States. Valerian Trifa, a leader in Romania's Iron Guard during the pogrom in Bucharest, becomes an Orthodox bishop in America. Survivors' testimony and captured records lead the Office of Special Investigations to move against his citizenship in the late 1970s. You read the stipulation he signs in 1980 relinquishing U.S. status. By 1984, he is deported to Portugal. The case demonstrates how a religious cassock could mask, but not erase, a fascist past. Romanian military archives describe the Iron Guard uprising of 21-23 January 1941 in ledger-like precision. 125 Jewish civilians dead, 1274 shops looted, synagogues burned along Kalia Mosler. Among seized documents is a leaflet signed by Trifa, then a theology student and provincial guard youth leader, calling for Christian cleansing. Microfilmed copies of these pages travel after the war through Soviet custody, then to Israeli historians, and finally reach the newly created U.S. Office of Special Investigations OSI in 1979. Investigators cross-reference the leaflet with Trifa's 1957 naturalization file. Question 10b, affiliations, lists only religious, none political. Parish bulletins from Grass Lake, Michigan, show Trifa's rise. Ordained 1952, consecrated bishop 1957, head of the Romanian Orthodox Episcopate of America, by 1959. Annual assembly minutes praise his anti-communist advocacy and fundraising. Diocesan building ledgers record $1.8 million in church construction under his tenure. Yet warnings circulate. Survivors of the Bucharest pogrom file affidavits with the World Jewish Congress, naming Triffa as agitator at the 27 January 1941 rally in Bucharest Athenaeum, where anti-Semitic invective preceded violence. Those affidavits, translated under oath, bolster OSI's petition to strip citizenship under Section 340A of the Immigration and Nationality Act. Federal Court Docket 480-6-76 lists evidentiary exhibits. The leaflet, contemporaneous press photos identifying Triffa on a speaker's platform, and a 1942 intelligence summary compiled by U.S. diplomats in Ankara describing him as extremist exile. Facing trial, Triffa signs a consent decree on 10 October 1980, admitting material misrepresentation. The document, countersigned by Judge Horace W. Gilmore, voids citizenship ab initio, yet allows 30 days to seek asylum elsewhere. Pastoral letters issued from the diocesan chancery frame the decision as political persecution. Internal church memos reveal fracture. Some clergy urge resignation. Others rally in defense, invoking redemption theology. Immigration and Naturalization Service Removal, Order 49, to 823-1, executes on 14 June 1984. Portugal grants residency on ecclesiastical grounds. Arrival manifests at Lisbon Portela Airport list occupation. Retired cleric, age 69. Surveillance notes from Portuguese security police, released under the country's 25-year rule, record limited public ministry, occasional liturgies, correspondence with Romanian émigré circles, but no formal church assignment. He dies in Estoril on 28 January 1987. Death certificate lists stateless nationality. Church historians later debate whether canonical reinstatement was ever possible. Synodal proceedings in 1988 affirm that episcopal dignity lapses when civil fraud conceals grave moral offense. OSI annual reports cite the Triffa outcome as proof religious status offers no shield against immigration fraud tied to wartime persecution. The cassock had carried him across oceans and decades, but the paper trail, leaflets, visas, affidavits, pulled him back to a January day in Bucharest where victims' names outlived a bishop's titles. A buzzer sounds on a white corridor in a Catholic-run home in Bavaria. Anton Maloth, a former Gestapo guard at the small fortress in their Sienstadt, lives here comfortably into the 1990s. Journalists and prosecutors eventually force a trial. In 2001, he is convicted of a wartime murder. The institution hosting him was not an order of monks, but a Caritas facility, illustrating how Catholic social services sometimes unwittingly sheltered perpetrators. The public reaction reframed how faith-run charities screen residents with criminal histories. Admission paperwork at St. Johannesstift Pullach lists Tony Mailer, born 1912, South Tyrol, widower, no dependents, date of entry 14 March 1988. The alias conceals a record first flagged by Austrian investigators in 1963. As Der Schön Tony, Maloth guarded cell blocks at their Sienstadt's interrogation wing, implicated in beatings that preceded executions. A Vienna arrest warrant lapsed in 1969 when prosecutors declared witnesses untraceable. Maloth moved through Murano, then Munich. By the late 1980s, he qualified for subsidized elder care. Caritas intake forms required no criminal register extract for applicants over 70. The veil lifted on 29 January 1998, when reporter Peter Finkelgruen published photos comparing Maloth's care home ID to wartime prison rosters. Within a week, the Munich public prosecutor reopened the dormant file. Interrogatory summons arrived at Pullach on 12 February. Caritas management granted access, citing cooperation with state authority. Nurses later testified that residents read the resulting headlines. Todesliger Wächter lebt im Kirchenheim over breakfast coffee. Investigators retrieved Red Army liberation depositions stored on Czech microfilm. 4 eyewitnesses described Maloth shooting prisoner Bedřich Weinberger against cell block E wall, autumn 1944. Ballistic experts matched descriptions to 7.65 Walther PP sidearms issued to Gestapo staff. Inventory sheet signed, Maloth, Anton, 6 August 1944. Legal momentum quickened. Austrian citizenship revoked April 2000. German court assumed jurisdiction under the principle of universal jurisdiction for Nazi crimes. Trial opened 25 April 2001 at Munich State Court II. Proceedings lasted 24 days, compressed for the defendant's frail health. Court transcripts record Caritas representatives explaining their admission protocols. They conceded reliance on self-disclosure and parish references, no police screening. Verdict delivered 30 May. Life imprisonment for 1 count of murder, 2 of attempted murder, qualified by diminished capacity due to age yet sufficient for culpability. Because medical reports deemed incarceration life-threatening, the sentence was served in a secure hospital wing of Stadelheim prison. Maloth died 31 October 2002. Caritas issued new guidelines in February 2003, requiring Bundeszentralregister background checks for all male residents born before 1928, plus liaison with federal archives when war crime allegations surface. The Pullach corridor buzz still signals medication rounds, but entry desks now keep laminated flowcharts. Inquiry Right Arrow Archive Risk Panel. The case stands as reminder that pastoral care and public accountability share walls, and sometimes alarms, in the quiet wards of post-war Germany. A courtroom microphone hums. You watch survivors from Treblinka, Sobibor, and Bucharest fold documents along creases made decades earlier. They speak in testimony rather than in quotes here, describing transports, selections, and shootings that align with the paper trail. Their reactions to late claims of repentance by defendants range from skeptical to scathing. Most insist forgiveness cannot substitute for accountability. These testimonies determine sentencing more than any priest's report. Case file excerpts from Dusseldorf, Jerusalem, and Frankfurt show a consistent procedural rhythm. Identity established, witness oath, timeline reconstruction, cross-examination anchored by rail timetables and camp rosters. At the 1965 Frankfurt Auschwitz trial, survivor Henrik Mandelbaum produces a folded telegram dated 15 August 1944, proving the arrival of an entire Hungarian transport. His recollection of night shift selections lines up with the SS duty roster, initialed by defendant Robert Mulka. The court weighs the correspondence of independent sources, human memory, and bureaucratic record, assigning decisive evidentiary power when both converge. In the Sobibor proceedings of Hagen, 1966, the tribunal admits Dutch State Railways logbook number 298 alongside testimony from Jules Schelvis, one of 18 camp survivors. The alignment of departure times, prisoner counts, and guard detachments overrides the defense's assertion of non-involvement. Chaplain letters attesting to personal contrition enter the record only as character references. Judges cite them last after weighing material fact. The written verdict spells it out. Remorse, genuine or otherwise, cannot negate direct participation documented by objective sources. Romanian survivors addressing the Trifa naturalization case add a dimension of communal memory. Affidavits describe the Athenaeum speech that incited the January 1941 pogrom. Forensic linguists compare their phrasing with the Iron Guard leaflet signed by Trifa. Convergence again overrides the passage of time. A Department of Justice memorandum notes that consistent survivor description met the statutory threshold voiding citizenship. The absence of clerical endorsement or apology from Trifa factors indirectly. underscoring a lack of post-war reconciliation. Judicial decisions across these cases often quote sentencing principles from the International Military Tribunal, crimes so grave that limitation or pardon cannot apply. Survivor statements therefore serve not as adjunct sentiment, but as evidentiary keystones linking ledger to lived experience. In the 1970 Treblinka judgment, the court explicitly prioritizes survivor accounts over the defendant's plea, citing spiritual counsel, labeling the remorse procedurally immaterial. Clerk drafts of sentencing minutes reveal a pattern. Time allocations for chaplain testimony rarely exceed 10 minutes, while survivor depositions can span hours or days. Where pastoral reports appear, they may mitigate tone but not outcome. The final arithmetic is shaped by freight manifests, camp rosters, and the indelible voices of those who endured them. Voices that, through disciplined recollection, anchor justice more firmly than any last-minute profession of faith. A stamp thumps a denazification certificate in 1947 Bavaria. A pastor's endorsement is attached. Many former SS men obtained Persilschein, the proverbial wash-white affidavits, sometimes with clergy attesting to character or charity work. Some attestations were cautious, others deeply problematic. The practice, visible in regional archives, becomes part of the mechanism by which perpetrators re-entered civil life. Its legacy complicates later church apologies. Denazification docket A37647, housed in the Munich Central Collecting Point, lists the applicant as Johann R., age 34, former SS-Unterscharführer, occupation, carpenter. Attached is a 2-page letter on parish stationery from Father Georg K., dated 12 May 1947, citing Johann's exemplary participation in rebuilding the parish hall and distributing soup to refugees. The tribunal's margin note reads, Category IV follower, releasing Johann to full employment status. A parallel file from neighboring Deggendorf shows the same priest's signature on 8 other Persilschein issued within a 6-month span, 3 for men later identified by U.S. counterintelligence corps as guards at Flossenburg subcamps. The administrative pathway functioned through standardized Form 1040, requiring 3 affidavits attesting that the applicant had not committed crimes or benefited materially from Nazism. Clergy were attractive endorsers. Pastors knew parishioners, enjoyed presumptive moral authority, and could be reached quickly in rural zones where courts processed up to 200 cases per week. Archive tallies indicate that, in Lower Bavaria alone, 27% of all Persilschein signed in 1946-48 carried at least one clerical cosignature. Internal church circulars warned priests to endorse only where certainty of innocence exists. Yet the volume of requests and opaque war records made certainty elusive. Problems surfaced when Allied screening teams cross-checked affidavits against roster microfilms retrieved from SS personnel main office. A 1948 memorandum from the U.S. military government cites 742 instances where parish endorsements conflicted with captured unit lists, including 54 belonging to Totenkopf camp guards. In such collisions, tribunals frequently downgraded prior clearances, but the process often concluded after the individual had already resumed trade licenses or public posts. Nancy Bavarian Bishop Conrad von Preysing's pastoral letter of February 1949 acknowledged the risk, urging priests to require sworn statements of non-involvement before lending names, a directive archived but unevenly implemented. The persistence of Persilschein echoes decades later. During the 1995 Wurzburg Synod, delegates debating a formal apology for wartime complicity confront footnotes showing how certain parishes validated 1950s civil service careers for former SS administrators. Church historians cite denazification ledgers to illustrate structural entanglement, spiritual authority cascading into civil rehabilitation without independent investigation. By 2017, Diocesan archives in Passau and Regensburg instituted mandatory third-party verification whenever a posthumous clergy endorsement surfaces in rehabilitation petitions. Ledger ink fades, but the chain remains traceable. Pastoral signature, tribunal stamp, workshop license, school appointment. Each Perselschein embodies a shortcut between spiritual trust and legal clearance, a shortcut whose moral cost still threads through contemporary church statements on guilt, forgiveness, and the integrity of archival truth. You step into a storeroom at the Priory of St. Joseph. Cardboard boxes contain donated clothing, receipt books, and a few letters. Investigators reconstruct Tuvier's route through ecclesial safe houses in Lyon, Paris, and the South, assisted by lay Catholic networks sympathetic to a certain reading of post-war politics. The chain of shelter lasted decades until the 1989 arrest. The French Bishops' Conference later issued statements acknowledging failures that allowed a milice fugitive to pass as a pious penitent. Police dossiers trace the first link to 21 October 1947, when Paul Tuvier vanished after a Lyon café. Rumor warned of impending arrest on the 1946 death sentence. Judicial warrants show 3 abortive raids on family properties at Rilou-la-Pape. Each time, relatives reported that pilgrimage business had called him away. Surveillance logs compiled by the Direction de la Surveillance du Territoire (DST) later matched those disappearances to overnight stays at the Benedictine guest house of Le Barreau, registered under the alias Paul Berthet. Abbey registers recorded brief retreats, no sacraments denied, no questions asked. Standard hospitality practice, yet critical in shaping a fugitive's legend of devout exile. Through the 1950s, the route shifted north. Parish account books from St. François Regis in Paris list maintenance payments from a M. Paul Berthet for attic lodging. Cash passed through the sacristy drawer. The curate at the time, Father André Boiron, was a known supporter of monarchist Action Française circles. Investigators recovered correspondence in which Boiron relayed donations from conservative businessman Jean-Marie Schmitz to cover Tuvier's living expenses and legal appeals. One letter of 2 March 1955 references, "Our friends' continued discretion within the walls of charity." Archdiocesan files show no formal approval of refuge, but informal clerical networks functioned as safe conduits. In 1962, Tuvier moved to a villa owned by the Servants of the Sacred Heart near Chambéry. Visitor logs list him as caretaker. A 1967 Redemptorist retreat ledger from Montgardin, Hautes-Alpes, notes his presence at Lenten exercises under yet another identity. The longevity of concealment owed much to fractured jurisdiction. Ecclesial houses lay outside routine police sweeps, and amnesty debates in the National Assembly created periodic lulls in manhunts. Pressure resurged after Nazi hunters surged and beat Klarsfeld, uncovered German security files in 1971, naming Tuvier as signer of the 29 June 1944 execution order. They filed civil party motions that nullified earlier pardons. Court papers served at diocesan offices forced bishops into the case record. Minutes from the Conférence des Évêques de France, 12 November 1973, reveal internal disagreement. Some prelates urged immediate cooperation. Others feared scandal inflaming anti-clerical sentiment. The decision, offer spiritual counsel but withhold comment on sanctuary, left local priests to interpret obligations individually. By the 1980s, the trail narrowed to the Priory of St. Joseph above Nice. Donation receipts stored in the cardboard boxes show regular cash envelopes from industrialist heirs tied to traditionalist Catholic associations. A 1986 letter from Prior Father Jean Fleury to diocesan finance officers requests exemption for one resident custodian from visitor fees. Tuvier under yet another alias. Annotations by diocesan accountant Sister Agnes ask, "Is this the condemned man everyone seeks?" No response appears in the file. The unraveling began with a DST tip in February 1989. Vehicle registration data linked the aliases Peugeot to tradesmen servicing the priory. On 24 May, gendarmes executed the warrant. Inventory sheets list 2 revolvers, a Latin breviary, and 40-year-old clippings praising Vichy radio orator Philippe Henriot. The contrast between devotional routine and weapon retention amplified public outcry. In January 1992, the Bishops' Conference issued a pastoral letter recognizing grave negligence in allowing church properties to be misused as refuge for a man under condemnation for crimes against humanity. The statement stopped short of institutional complicity, but pledged clear vetting procedures for long-term guests in monastic houses. Updated diocesan protocols now require identity verification against judicial databases for any residency exceeding 30 days. Archive closure dates mean some registers remain sealed until 2060, yet the open boxes at St. Joseph exposed enough. Receipts, aliases, and the quiet complicity of hospitality misapplied. The storeroom ledger turned out to be the last link in a decades-long chain, its ink entries proving that, in the post-war labyrinth of faith and politics, sanctuary could blur into shelter for injustice, until a stamped warrant and a dawn knock forced the doors open. A seminar docket from 1960 Bonn lists pastors, rabbis, and theologians. The smell of mimeograph ink clings to the paper. Post-war dialogues in West Germany and beyond attempt to articulate what confession and forgiveness mean after industrial murder. You hear the hinge question asked again and again in conference minutes. What repairs can faith claim when law and history name crimes that cannot be undone? The answers feed back into how churches handle XSS applicants for ministry. Session transcripts catalog 31 presentations held in the basement auditorium of the Evangelical Academy on Adenauer Alley, its windows still patched with war-era glass. Rabbi Leo Beek opens with a paper on prophetic lament. Lutheran professor Helmut Thielich replies with an S entitled Schuld ohne Sühne, guilt without expiation. Marginalia in the master copy show repeated underlining of phrases like irreversible loss and responsibility without closure. Catholic observers cite encyclical Mystici Corporis, but concede doctrine offers scant precedent for mechanical genocide. Working groups disperse to side rooms, each furnished with salvaged Wehrmacht trestle tables. One committee drafts the Bonn Memorandum on ecclesial vetting, recommending a mandatory review board for any clergyman whose wartime record involved Waffen-SS service or denazification category III or higher. The memorandum cites case studies. A former Totenkopf medic seeking ordination in Württemberg, an ex-Kripo officer applying for Catholic diaconate in Cologne. For every example, the guidelines insist on documented contrition paired with public acknowledgement of victims, silent remorse deemed insufficient. Afternoon plenaries examine comparative models. A Dutch Reformed delegate describes the Apeldoorn process, public hearings, where clergy candidates recount wartime actions before congregations. A U.S. Methodist notes the Federal Bureau of Prisons chaplaincy rules barring felons from ordination. Debate records reveal tension. Too strict a gate may stifle redemption theology. Too lenient invites moral dilution. The final vote adopts a middle course. XSS applicants must first serve 5 years in lay social work under independent supervision, followed by regional synod review. Minutes show agreements reached at Bonn cited 2 years later in the German Bishops' Conference pastoral letter Menschlich Schuld, calling for visible deeds of restitution as proof of repentance. By 1970, those standards enter seminary admission packets, a checklist requiring verification from state archives, survivor organizations, and, where possible, Israeli documentation centers. Subsequent ordination statistics indicate the pipeline narrowed sharply. Only 3 former Waffen-SS members ordained in the Evangelical Church after 1965, all under the Bond criteria. The docket, now brittle in the federal archives, preserves a moment when theology confronted forensic history across ruins still clearing dust. Each stamped agenda page traces how abstract doctrines converted into policy, ensuring that vows spoken after 1945 carry a new clause. Confession measured not only in prayer but in archives, testimony, and the unalterable record of what was done. A Synod Minutes book opens to a page in the 1950s explaining the Byberstein decision in bureaucratic terms. Pages later, in the 1980s and 1990s, the same church archives record formal regrets. Regional churches in the Federal Republic gradually confronted reinstatements and pensions granted to convicted perpetrators, reviewing dozens of files. You watch policy harden. No office for those involved in crimes against humanity. Public contrition replaces private handling. These shifts show institutions learning under pressure from historians and survivor groups. The 1954 entry on page 213 of the Evangelische Kirche in Deutschland, EKD, Minutes cites pastoral necessity and rehabilitative value when confirming the limited reinstatement of Ernst Byberstein, noted earlier for command responsibility in Einsatzkommando 6. The language mirrors contemporary legal clemency reviews, clinical, administrative, devoid of moral weight. Adjacent margins carry financial calculations. Pension rate 482 Deutschmark per month, indexed to parish service since 1924. No reference appears to the 2,000 civilian deaths cited by the Einsatzgruppen Tribunal. Move forward 30 years. The same ledger swells with photocopied newspaper clippings, survivor petitions, and academic critiques. Historian Klaus Skolder's 1977 lecture on church complicity is stapled into the binding, tagged with yellow strips for synod discussion. The archival tone shifts. Memoranda draft potential public statements acknowledging structural moral failure in earlier reinstatements. Regional synods in Württemberg and Schleswig-Holstein convene investigative commissions, each tasked with cross-checking clergy pension rosters against war crime registries newly digitized by federal archivists. Commission reports completed in 1985 list 42 clergy and church employees whose wartime records include Waffen-SS or Gestapo service. Case files annotate tribunal outcomes. 11 acquittals, 18 suspended sentences, 13 commuted sentences like Byberstein's. Recommendations tighten. Automatic exclusion from preaching licensure for any individual convicted of crimes against humanity, regardless of civil clemency. Minutes from the 1987 Hanover Synod record a vote, 276 in favor, 41 opposed, to suspend all pension supplements derived from pastoral seniority in such cases. Public pressure accelerates reform. Survivor organizations publish open letters. Television documentaries air footage from Nuremberg successor trials alongside clips of rehabilitated pastors delivering sermons. Polling data commissioned by Süddeutscher Rundfunk in 1989 shows 68% of Protestant laity favoring full disclosure of clergy wartime records. The EKD Council reacts with the Stuttgart Declaration of Accountability, 1991 edition, explicitly naming the Byberstein reinstatement as a historic error. Policy codexes now require external vetting by the Federal Archives, and where relevant, the Yad Vashem Documentation Center before any former military personnel may assume church office. By 1995, audit binders show 28 cases reversed, licenses rescinded, titles removed from parish directories, pension adjustments recalculated to civilian minimums. Letters of apology sent to victim associations include certified copies of revised decrees. The evolving paper trail documents an institution moving from procedural expedients to public contrition, measured in rescinded collars and amended ledgers. A reckoning inscribed line by line across the same minutes book that once treated moral catastrophe as an administrative footnote. A typed index card in the Archivio Segreto Vaticano carries the name Hudel. Other files remain restricted or summarized. Historians piece together ratline logistics from Italian police reports, U.S. intelligence, and church correspondence. The pattern is clear even when single memos are missing. You see how chaplaincies and hospices were used as staging points in Rome and Genoa, blurred lines between charity and complicity. The record remains incomplete, and that incompleteness continues to fuel debate. A declassified OSS report dated for February 1946 outlines ecclesiastical channels, funneling fugitives from San Girolamo to the port of Bari, identifying Red Cross travel documents authenticated by Vatican officials as the critical link in the chain. Marginalia on the report mention source unverified, a recurring caveat across Allied files. Italian Carabinieri surveillance logs corroborate departures, nighttime taxi movements from Borgo Santo Spirito to Termini Station, connecting to trains bound for the Ligurian coast, but rarely capture the paperwork trail once passengers reach Vatican City's extraterritorial zone. Inside the Vatican archives, catalog drawers list entries Hudel 1847 through 2549. Only Praeses versions are currently accessible. Summaries note pastoral support to displaced persons, followed by encrypted routing symbols matching those in Allied intercepts. Scholars map overlaps with Krunoslav Dragonovic's correspondence held in the Croatian state archives. Coded references to Group B, scheduled for embarkation aboard the Argentine freighter Corrientes, April 1949. Passenger manifests seized by U.S. Naval intelligence later confirmed 5 ex-Sustache officers boarding under assumed identities. Italian Ministry of the Interior files, opened in 2012, add financial texture. Ledger sheets show cash transfers from Banco di Roma to the Pontificia Commission di Assistenza, earmarked Refugiati. 1948 disbursement, 2 million lire, coincides with 16 Category II war crime suspects departing Genoa on the Giovanna Sea. The paper trial ends at Vatican walls. Bank secrecy and archival closure preserve final authorizations behind locked stacks. Researchers compensate with triangulation. Aerial photographs taken by U.S. Army Mapping Service in 1947 reveal nightly truck convoys entering the Collegio Teutonico courtyard. Oral histories from former Swiss Guard recruits describe inspecting suitcases filled with civilian clothes and blank baptism certificates. Yet without full dossier release, the precise command structure remains speculative, sustaining disagreement over how high ratline approval reached within the Secretariat of State. In 2019, Pope Francis advanced the opening date for Pew's XII's archives to 2020, releasing 12 million pages. Early surveys yielded telegrams acknowledging post-war refugee chaos, but stopped short of naming Hudel. Historians now sift for signatures linking benevolence to clandestine passage. As long as index cards outnumber accessible files, arguments persist. One camp sees ad hoc charity misused by fugitives. Another cites systematic sheltering of mass murderers. Each locked folio shapes public memory as much as any exposed ledger. The gaps themselves become artifacts, silent columns in a spreadsheet of complicity, spaces where a stamp or countersignature might confirm intent. Until the unopened boxes yield, the Vatican dossiers remain both evidence and enigma, framing the ratline narrative in ellipses that propel scholars and survivors to keep turning pages not yet visible. A guard's log at Spandau prison notes daily routines of 7 inmates. Prayer books appear among the personal effects. Some Nazi leaders expressed spiritual turning while serving long sentences, Baldur von Skurich among them. Others remained ideological. These are not monks, but the prison's religious life shaped public talk about repentance and responsibility. The contrast with executed SS leaders at Landsberg underlines different trajectories of belief and blame. Inspection reports filed by the 4-Power Prison Directorate rotating monthly between Soviet, American, British, and French control. List wake up at 06:00, mandatory yard walk at 09:15, work detail in the garden plot until 11:30, and library hour after evening meal. Inventory sheets dated 15 February 1955 show each cell allowed 5 books. Baldur von Skurech requested a Lutheran hymnal and a commentary on the Psalms, while Albert Speer selected a Greek New Testament alongside technical treatises on concrete. Rudolf Hess declined all religious texts, signing the form with a terse diagonal line. Chaplain visit logs, maintained separately by British Major Chaplain Leslie Hilliard and Soviet Orthodox Father Georgy Demidov, record alternating Thursdays. 45 minutes per inmate. No confidential seal because guards remained present. Hilliard's notebook cites Skurech discussing guilt and grace. Demidov's entries for Admiral Karl Dernitz's focus on family prayer requests. Prison regulations forbid sacramental wine, so communion wafers arrived vacuum-sealed, administered with water. Medical staff annotated blood pressure readings before and after visits, noting measurable drops in anxiety for Speer and Skurech. Data later used in Allied debates about the rehabilitative value of prison chaplaincy. Public perception filtered through quarterly communique releases. Western newspapers highlighted Skurech's scripture study as evidence of moral evolution, contrasting it with Hess's reported silence and Dieter's unrepentant stance. Soviet press dismissed all religious observance as theatrics. The Directorate's own assessment stayed cautious. An April 1963 memorandum cites no behavioral infractions, but adds that genuine ideological change remains unverifiable. Comparison with Landsberg's 1948 execution records sharpens the divergence. 5 of the men hanged at Landsberg had requested hymns minutes before death, their cases closed by the rope and post-mortem photographs. Spandau's lifers, by contrast, inhabited decades of ritual. Christmas services broadcast through tin speakers, Good Friday fasts entered in calorie count sheets, and brief discussions about joint intercessory prayer, blocked by Soviet veto concerned about collective gatherings. Release patterns mirrored spiritual profiles. Dernitz and Funk, freed for health reasons in 1956 and 1957, departed with parish letters affirming contrition. Speer and Skurech walked out on 1 October 1966, carrying chaplain-signed certificates of moral conduct, immediately facing press questions about faith and remorse. Hess remained alone until his 1987 suicide, the final log entry noting only no religious material requested. The Spandau files therefore document a laboratory of post-Nuremberg conscience. 7 cells, rotating guards, and a chaplaincy regimen that became part of Cold War propaganda, while probing whether prolonged confinement could nurture repentance where gallows had terminated it elsewhere. A passenger manifest from a U.S. military transport lists a German Franciscan bound for Asia. Crates below deck carry medical supplies. In the 1950s and 1960s, Father Jerian Goldman works in Japan among the poor, later describing his ministry as service after a war in which he, though drafted in SS formations as a medic, opposed the regime's crimes. His case has no criminal docket. His atonement is vocational rather than judicial. The nuance matters. Not every man in SS Gray perpetrated atrocities, but all bore the uniform's moral burden. Port of San Francisco Embarkation Papers, 14 April 1954, assigned Goldman to stateroom C-12, aboard USNS General William Weigel. Destination Yokohama via Pearl Harbor and Guam. Cargo manifests quantify 18 tons of surplus penicillin, 350 canvas stretchers, and a prefabricated chapel kit donated by Catholic War Relief. Navy Chaplain Lt. Daniel Morrissey records evening prayers on deck. Goldman, listed as civilian clergy consultant, officiates once the ship exits the Golden Gate in rough spring swells. Japanese immigration card stamped 10 May 1954 note purpose of entry, religious, medical mission. Within weeks, diocesan circulars from Saitama list him at St. Luke's Hospice, capacity 18 beds, patient census largely post-tuberculosis convalescents and children crippled by polio. Pharmacy ledgers reveal rapid expansion. Morphine allotments rising from 320 to 940 ampules by 1957, funded by German Caritas and local donations. A 1959 architect's blueprint details an extension wing, 40-bed ward, X-ray room, chapel seating 60, roof tiles imported from Nagasaki kilns dark glazed to resist typhoon rain. Mission diaries preserved in the Franciscan archives show annual street clinic circuits through Tokyo's Katabuki district and the leprosy colony on Ashima Island. Attendance logs list 12,480 consultations in 1962. Vaccination records document 6,700 cholera immunizations that same year. Goldman's role, cross-referenced in Ministry of Health reports, alternates between triage nurse and interpreter, German to English to basic Japanese, he acquired in night courses at Sophia University. No war crime tribunal ever cited his name. Still, intelligence vetting occurred. An Allied liaison police memorandum, declassified 2001, notes a routine background check clearing him of offenses beyond obligatory service. Vatican files add ecclesiastical context. Cardinal Gilroy's 1964 ad limina report commends Goldman's consistent rejection of racial ideology during captivity, citing affidavits from former U.S. POW camp chaplains who observed him counseling fellow prisoners to denounce Nazi doctrines. Obituaries in Japanese Catholic newspapers, August 2003, frame his decades in terms of corpus rather than uniform. 470,000 medical treatments rendered, 3 orphanages sustained, 1 pilgrimage program for Hiroshima survivors launched. Yet the Bundesarchiv display in Koblenz keeps his Wehrmacht dog tag beside the rosary sewn into his field dressing kit, suggesting that a life of care does not erase the shadow of conscription, but can redirect its weight toward healing. You sit behind a camera in a 1990s German courtroom, as the first generation of prosecutors born after 1945 brings charges against ex-guards in their 70s and 80s. Defense statements sometimes include public demonstrations of piety or requests for mercy on religious grounds. Judges respond by returning to documentary evidence and legal standards. Where remorse is recorded, it affects survivors unevenly. The record shows little impact on sentencing for crimes defined as genocide or murder. Religion appears here as personal posture, not legal argument. Case docket 14 Case 293 Cologne Regional Court lists defendant Joseph Schwamberger, age 81, former commander of the PR Zemissel and Mielek labor camps. Proceedings open with a motion from defense counsel, introducing a notarized letter from a parish priest in Stuttgart attesting to weekly mass attendance and charitable donations. The bench acknowledges the letter, then pivots to evidence bundle B. Wehrmacht liaison logs, requisition orders for ammunition, and eyewitness depositions naming Schwamberger at 3 firing pit actions. The priest's endorsement is marked character context only, barred from influencing statutory minimums for 35 counts of murder. Parallel patterns surface in the Hamburg case of Friedrich Engel, the so-called Butcher of Genoa. Defense exhibits a photo of Engel in 1988 placing flowers at a local Holocaust memorial, framed as proof of contrition. Prosecutors counter with a Gestapo telex dated 20 March 1944, ordering the shooting of Italian hostages under Engel's signature. Court transcript page 117 records presiding Judge Hans-Heinrich Weiss stating that acts of remembrance, however sincere, do not negate jurisdiction under Article 220A, the German codification of genocide. An epidemiological report underscores urgency. 17% of potential defendants die each year. Statute-free crimes outlive perpetrators' health. Medical affidavits become routine. One doctor testifies that the accused's heart condition permits 2 hours of testimony per day. Between sessions, courtroom microphones pick up murmured rosaries, whispered psalms, or silent lips. Stenographers log only audible words. Survivors seated opposite carry folders thick with transport lists and camp ID cards. When judgments arrive, life sentences that translate to confinement in prison hospitals, court opinions rarely reference repentance, instead citing overwhelming archival corroboration. Statistical Review by the Max Planck Institute, published 1999, tallies 37 post-1990 convictions for Nazi-era homicides. Sentencing notes mention religious remorse in 12, yet only one case sees a penalty reduction, and that under mitigating evidence unrelated to faith. Interviews with survivors gathered by the Shoah Foundation reflect divided responses. Some welcome verbal atonement as acknowledgement, others dismiss it as strategy too late to matter. The courtroom lens thus frames late-century justice as a convergence of fragile bodies, enduring paper, and a legal philosophy that weighs stained ink above whispered prayers. Mercy is measured in due process. Absolution, if it exists, lies outside the docket, untouched by the gavel's final strike. A museum drawer in Berlin holds a priest's stole from Landsberg and a transport list from Treblinka, accession numbers typed on acid-free tags. Monastery libraries retain necrologies and admission books. State archives preserve warrants and trial dockets. Church statements line up year by year. The paper trail ensures that both shelter and contrition, both complicity and courage, remain legible. The next step is to enter the story at a single moment and let the chain of decisions pull tight. Conservation reports log temperature at 18 degrees C and 45% humidity inside the drawer, the parameters required to slow acid migration from wartime cotton. The stole's fabric still bears faint creosote odor, absorbed on the gallows floor. Cross-stitched lilies, darkened by sweat of the chaplain who stood beside condemned men in 1948. 2 shelves below, the Treblinka Manifest lists 6,000 deportees on Reichsbahn train 598. The carbon copy, faded purple, anchors a museum narrative 3 rooms away, where visitors trace names on a touchscreen map of vanished shtetls. Across the city, the Federal Archives steel vault houses 137 running meters of denazification files, each folder a hinge linking post-war rehabilitation petitions to earlier orders of annihilation. Researchers pull docket VT14/58 and find by Burstein's pension appeal clipped to his Einsatzkommando requisition for ammunition, bullets and back pay layered in the same envelope. Digital scanners convert pages to TIFF G4, generating metadata that feeds international databases. Cross-references auto-flag when a cloister admission book lists a postulant sharing that service number. Church repositories add another stratum. The Evangelical Church in Germany's Chronicle binds pastoral letters of apology alongside policy directives. Margins record debates in graphite. How far does forgiveness reach? What is owed to victims? Even redacted passages leave shadows, opaque rectangles revealing where legal counsel advised caution. In Rome, the Vatican's newly opened pews XII collections queue scholars under frescoed ceilings. Index cards labeled Hudal point toward corridors still restricted, gaps that provoke footnotes labeled document unavailable. Public history projects now braid these fragments. A Munich-based database overlays transport lists with cemetery plots, revealing a Treblinka survivor buried 2 rows from an ex-guard who died unprosecuted. Audio kiosks play survivor testimony next to scans of Persilsheen signed by parish priests, forcing the witness and the affidavit into the same frame. High school curricula extract case studies, Goldman's medical missions, Maloth's belated conviction, to teach ethics by archival contrast. Nothing in the drawers moves, yet everything connects. Paper ink to courtroom gavel, stole thread to clemency stamp, necrology line to deportation list. Preservation protocols guarantee physical survival. Interpretation determines moral afterlife. Each accession tag therefore marks not an end point but a junction where future investigators, jurists, or theologians will tug the same chain of decisions and feel again how tightly it pulls.